A big hello and a big welcome to everybody. Of course, everybody who's with us live today, and also anybody who's tuning in to watch the recording of this on YouTube. My name is Roman. My job is short, simple, and I will get out of the way very quickly. I want to say thank you, of course, to Rakshanda, somebody that I've read, whose work I've admired. Of course, Rakshanda, we've invited you here today as a translator, but I think that single word does perhaps a disservice to all the things you do. Writer, translator, critic. I think also language activist is probably a fair label as well. And I guess there's a fair argument to be made that you can't really do translation without being a language activist of some sort. Of course, Shwetha will introduce you, I think, in more detail for anybody who's not familiar with your work. But from me and from everyone here at Himal, a big thank you. And also to everybody who's joining us or tuning in, just to say that this is, of course, part of the 2026 Himal Fiction Fest. We do the Fiction Fest once every year to make sure that there is a platform for bright young talents in South Asian fiction writing to also find their way into our minds and into our worlds. Every other year we do a translation focused event, and that is what we have this year. If you've not already read all of the great translation stories, translated stories that we have up on the Himal Fiction Fest, please go to himalmag.com and enjoy them. And of course, the reason we're able to do things like this is because we're an independent magazine, and that means that we rely on the support of our readers to become paying Himal patrons to support our work. So please do consider becoming a paying supporter so that Himal can keep doing Fiction Fest and all the other things that it does for South Asia. So with that big thank you, and also a thank you to Lydia behind the scenes, who's been instrumental. Lydia is an editorial fellow at Himal who's been instrumental in putting all of this together. And of course, to Shwetha, your host, I will hand over to her.
Thank you, Roman, and welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us. This conversation is a part of Himal's Fiction Fest, our annual celebration of short stories and literary translation from across South Asia. Last week, we launched this edition with introductions from this year's translators, a fascinating conversation with Deepa Basti and Parvana Fayaz on the politics of translation, and also the announcement of the 2026 Armory Square Prize for South Asian Literature in Translation. Since then, we've published stories bringing readers fiction translated from Kashmiri, Sinhala, Tamil, Telugu, Gujarati, and Balochi. And the final story will be published this Friday. So if you haven't already, please do visit our website and spend some time with this fantastic collection. One of the things we've always hoped is that Fiction Fest would draw attention not only to the stories themselves, but also to the people that make those stories possible, including the translators who help them find new readers. So I'm delighted to be joined by the acclaimed Hindi-Urdu translator, writer, and literary historian, Rakhshanda Jalil. Over the course of her career, Rakhshanda has translated, edited, and written extensively on Hindi and Urdu literature, helping introduce generations of readers to some of the most important writers, poets, and intellectual traditions of the region. She is also the founder of Hindustani Awaz, an organization dedicated to preserving and promoting South Asian literary and cultural heritage. Rakhshanda, thank you so much for being here. It's such an honor.
Thank you, Shwetha. My pleasure.
And I'd like to begin with your own journey into translation. What drew you to it? And over the years, how has your understanding of what a translator does changed?
Okay, I started off very serendipitously, the kindness of a random stranger. I'd gone for a work meeting. I was working as an assistant editor at the India International Center. I'd gone for a work meeting to the Sahitya Academy, and the editor, a certain Mr. Rao, got talking about Premchand and the fact that the copyright has just expired and how he's looking for someone to translate a story for him. And then he pulls out his drawer and pulls out this story and just plonks it in front of me and says, "Why don't you give it a shot?" And I'm this young person who's sort of drifting through life without any aim or purpose. And I'm like, I haven't really translated ever before. He says, yeah, fine, but give it a shot. And this random stranger whom I'm meeting for the first time shows this trust in me and said, take it and see if you can translate it. I go back home, I pound away at my father's battered old typewriter. This is a 92, right? There are no computers and laptops around. And I give it to him, and he promptly publishes it in one of India's premier literary magazines, Indian Literature, which is the magazine of the Sahitya Academy. And I'm like somebody who has tasted blood. And I embark upon a trajectory that I'd never thought for myself, that I'd never planned, that was not even much of a career trajectory back in 92. Yes, there were translators, there was Jay Ratan and others who were translating from Hindi and Urdu. But it was a fledgling field. It was, and there was so much that could be done. And as I seized the bit, as it were, with great enthusiasm, and over the next 35 years, just relentlessly kept translating.
And a thread that runs through so much of your work is the relationship between Hindi and Urdu.
Yeah.
They're often presented as separate literary worlds, but your work really highlights a much more connected history. Do you believe that translation helps recover these literary conversations that borders and linguistic nationalism have made increasingly harder to see?
And while it may have been serendipity that guided me towards Premchand, but I can't think of a better example than Premchand, who straddles the world of both Urdu and Hindi like a colossus, and shows us that actually these boundaries are often very artificial. Yes, there is a difference of a script, but the grammar is the same, you see, the syntax is the same. Vocabulary is different, yes, but so it's a very artificial distinction, often a very political one as well. So the work I do with Hindustani Awaz, this organization that I set up in 2001, is also towards looking for commonalities. It's very easy to harp on differences, and we live in a world, in a very polarized world, in South Asia in particular, where we like to go looking for differences. Whereas we'd make our own life and the world around us that much easier and simpler if we went looking for the commonalities. And I think literary translations can sometimes show the way. After all, what is a translation? At its most basic, it's a bridge. It's a literary bridge between literary cultures, literary sensibilities, literary sensitivities, and all the rest of it. Cultural sensitivities as well. So I think there's nothing better than the act of translation, or what comes out as a product of translation, which is a translated text that is actually showing us the way forward. That yes, there are differences, linguistic and others, between languages, but there is a way of creating a bridge across those seemingly disparate banks of a river. And a translation does that. And in the case of Hindi and Urdu, there's something called lipi antar, which means transliteration. That is also the way forward. I personally don't subscribe to the school of huge changes within translation. I feel that there's a fidelity to a text, So this business of transcreation, which some people believe in, I don't subscribe to that. I don't think we are in the business of transcreating a text. I think we need to be very, very faithful to a text. And then we can find other ways of giving our own inputs. It could be an introductory essay, it could be footnotes, it could be a glossary, it could be a whole bunch of things. But I don't think we need to impose ourselves as writers in the act of translation. So that I think should remain sacred. But yes, there can be ways and means of value addition, which in the course of my 35 years as a translator, I've been looking at. 92, when I first published my very first book, which was Premchand's collection of short stories, when HarperCollins had just opened shop in India. The book was called The Temple and the Mosque. That was also the title story that Dr. Rao had given me and that he'd published in his magazine. and that became the title of my first book. So I wrote a very modest 2-page introduction, and I called it Translator's Note. I've come a long way from 92 to now. I like to write very long introductory essays. Again, I'm not inserting myself in the translation per se. I hold the sanctity of the text in place, but I do want to give something more to the reader, which they may or may not get, or may get partially, or can do with an introduction. And I like to call this process, this which has been a journey for me as well, I like to call it from text to context. That when I started out in 92, I thought my job was just to translate a text. And that 2-page modest translator's note I wrote was it. And then it took me all these years to figure out that, I'd like to add more to this, another layer. I'm not in the business of gilding the lily. I'm not here to improve upon a text. But yes, if I have the means to give a context, then I consider that also part of my job. And this is something I've learned over the years.
I was going to say, transcreation is such an interesting way of thinking about it. And your work spans canonical figures like Premchand, Manto, Kurutilin Haidar, but you've also devoted considerable energy to recovering and reintroducing literary writers like Rashid Jahan of the Progressive Writers Movement. How do you decide which writers need translating or recovering, and what role can translation play in shaping the literary canon that future generations in South Asia can inherit and take forward?
For me, translation is an act of politics. It reflects my own politics, you can say. Just a little while ago, before starting this conversation with you, I was watching something, and Nasiruddin Shah was being interviewed by somebody, and they asked him about his choice in cinema. And he said an actor is also, what he chooses, she chooses to act in or be associated with in cinema is a reflection of his or her politics. And that made me think that, yeah, actually, even translation is a form of, is a reflection of one's politics. After all, I'm not a commercial translator. Remember, there's a distinction between commercial translations and literary translations. A commercial translation could be, instructions for a washing machine, or how to put on bleach on your face. That little folded booklet that comes in a box. Those are commercial translations. AI can do that. ChatGPT can do that. Yes, ChatGPT is also doing literary translations, but in our choice of a text, I think we make a conscious choice. And in my case, I think what appeals to me, often it could be something that is which takes me by surprise. Phanishwarnath Renu, the preeminent Hindi writer from Bihar. When I first translated Renu's stories, I had not even been to Bihar. I'm not from, it's not my home state. So it's not like it spoke to me at subliminal level. No, it didn't. And yet it spoke to me in a manner that I wanted to share with others. So there is this amazing joy of discovering a writer, and sometimes you want to share that. So that is the thing about being a loose cannon, you can say, that you can pick and choose. Something sort of catches your attention and you want to transmit that joy. Same with Intezar Hussain. I read some of his short stories, this major Urdu writer from Pakistan. And the relations between India and Pakistan are often fraught, and it's difficult sometimes to push a Pakistani writer towards a publisher. But I've been very lucky. I've published Zehra Nigah, an Urdu poet from Karachi. I've published Intezar Hussain, a major Urdu writer from Lahore. And I've found publishers who are willing to go that extra distance and who are willing to look at a text, the sheer power and beauty of a text, and the brilliance of a writer, regardless of their which side of the border they're from. So there is a politics insofar as what you want to talk about. Let's say I translate something, and midway through it I realize, no, this is hugely regressive. It talks of things, let's say it talks of women in a bad way. It objectifies women. Do I really want to do this? I'd much rather abandon that than carry on with it. So, yeah, I mean, as a freelance person, you have that leeway. You can choose. You're not bonded labor. You're not working for somebody. You can choose what you want to translate and then find a publisher for.
I'm glad you brought up publishers because as someone who's published nearly 50 books, what's the publishing landscape for translations like in South Asia?
Yeah. So 92, when I started out, as I said, in every which way, this was fledgling. Penguin and others had started open shop. HarperCollins, mine was the first book HarperCollins did in 92. One of 5 books that HarperCollins had started out with when they opened shop in India. So yeah, I've had a ringside view of the publishing scene changing from Jayco and those other publishing companies that were homegrown to the arrival of Penguin first and then HarperCollins, and then now everybody has an India office today. And I've published with a great many of them. And talking of translations in particular, I can say, and I've done both, translated both poetry and fiction and non-fiction as well. I can say that there is a great deal of interest, there's a great deal of openness. Even when a commissioning editor is not familiar with a text, if you explain a story to them, they're willing and open to the idea of publishing it. Let me give you an example. I'd already published some short stories of Intezar Hussain with HarperCollins. And then I came across this novel, and I went to a commissioning editor at HarperCollins who had not read that novel, yet who agreed to take it at face value and go ahead and commission and sign a contract and just, publish it. So we are seeing that openness, and we have to give credit to various commissioning editors who've shown great foresight, great openness, great generosity of spirit, while Urdu or Hindi not being their mother tongue, their first language or second language, they're willing and open to the idea of publishing from languages that are, as it were, not their own. And this is important because we are linguistically very chauvinistic in South Asia. We make a distinction between our language and languages that are not our own. So it's taken a great deal of openness on the part of commissioning editors and various publishing companies to showcase this wealth of literatures that we have, and in all fairness, I must say, there's a whole lot of players, not just publishers, booksellers. The fact that they have dedicated spaces in most major bookstores and chains of bookstores, for translations. You have entire dedicated shelves for translation. Similarly, Litfest directors, it's not just the big ones like Jaipur Litfest and others, but I go to so many of the smaller, as it were, the B-Town, the C-Town Litfest as well, which have dedicated sessions for translations. And I think all of this together, book review editors in 92, I remember it took a really brave book review editor to give you space for a translated text to be reviewed. Today, I'm seeing books in translation being very generously reviewed, given the same kind of, space that any other text would. So it's a combination of not just publishers, but book review editors, bookshop owners, sales and marketing people. I remember in 92, for my first book, they were kind of wary of a book launch because, even tea and biscuits seemed like a bit of a stretch. And now there are decent book launches.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to be hopeful for in the publishing landscape for translation. Is there anything that you would hope would change in the publishing landscape in terms of the range of languages available?
Later, I would be very happy if there were more generous advances. We still have to do a lot of haggling. Nowhere are we commensurate with, let's say, a big name in English being given the kind of money that they are willing to shell out for translations. So, yeah, those of us who are freelance writers do depend on our literary advances for books. And till that is stretched, stretched to what it is. I mean, it has come a long way from what it was 30 odd years when I first published. But it would be nicer if translations were uh, seen at par with original works of fiction when it comes to advances, at least. It's a work in progress. Like I say, I've seen the improvement, but I'd be happy if it stretches.
Definitely. And Rakshanda, you've translated and championed a number of women writers over the course of your career, including a recent project to make Pakistani women's writing more accessible. I'm curious whether there are any themes or voices in women's writing that you feel have been overlooked in the way South Asian literary history is usually told.
As a feminist, it troubles me when people assume that women's writing is or should be of interest to women writers. That's really absurd. It's like saying Black American writing should only be written by Black Americans and should be read by Black Americans, or Dalit writing, or what have you. So these silos that we create, I think these are really wrong and bad. It's absurd to think that women's writing is of interest only to women writers, or it is only about womanly subjects. Women writers have moved a long way. I mean, those Courtyard and other stories that we saw 70, 80 years ago, those, even the titles, forget the contents, have gone through a huge change. So it seemed to me that half the population is writing for whom? Are these women writing only for women? Should they be read only for women? That was the point that was the point of questioning from which I approached these. And then I found no, they're writing about things that are of interest to everybody, or at least should be. And coming from that space, then of course, when you put together an anthology, you are looking for a peg to hang the anthology. So if it's women's writing from South Asia, or if it is, I've over the years done a bunch of collections of short stories. So I go looking for a peg. It could be communalism, it could be the male gaze. How do men look at women? So I had a book called The Male Gaze, where I was looking at male writers, not women writers, but just men. And we know how the male poet has looked at the woman, especially in Urdu. But I was curious, how have the male writers in the languages that I read and access, which is Urdu, Hindi, and to some extent Punjabi, and English, of course, how have these writers looked at women? So I went, male gaze is a term for cinema, but it applies to equally to literature. So I was curious, how would a man depict a woman? And then I presented that spectrum of possibilities.
That's fascinating, Rakshanda. I will definitely be checking out that book. And we've been talking about translation in quite broad terms, but I'd love to move a little bit closer to your work itself. One thing readers don't often get to see is what actually happens behind the scenes of a translation. When you first encounter a text, what is it that you're listening for, and how does a piece of writing travel from that first reading to the finished translation that eventually reaches us readers?
Ordinarily, there are multiple drafts, as in any manuscript. I mean, you don't expect to dictate it into a dictaphone and out comes a perfect manuscript. I spent years as a copy editor. I used to work in publishing companies, so I like to turn in very clean, good copy that's ready to go to press virtually. So I like to edit myself. I like to look out for inconsistencies and things that are loose or repetitive. So I do a fairly rigorous edit myself. But I want to share one experience with you which was different from all the others. I mentioned earlier that there was a book, novel by Intizar Hussain, which was signed up by my commissioning editor at HarperCollins. She hadn't read the novel in Urdu. But what I want to share with your listeners now is neither had I. I was familiar with the rest of Intizar Hussain's Uber, but not that particular novel, Aage Samandar Hai, which I translated as The Sea Lies Ahead. And this was an experiment I did. I would read only as much as I intended to translate on that given day. It took me a year and a half, and it's a big fat novel in Urdu. I would translate read a para, a page, a few lines, only as much as I planned to translate. So I was the effective first reader and also the translator. And I would resist the impulse to read the next line or the next page or the next para. If I was done for the day and I knew I couldn't do more on this today, then I would resist the impulse of reading what followed. And the next day, when I would pick it up, I would again read that. So it was like reading a book for the first time. And that was a goosebump inducing experience. I thought I was being a pioneer, and then my friend Arunava Sinha, who's my fellow traveler and friend in the world of translations, a very active, very prolific translator from Bangla. You would have heard of him. Arunava kind of deflated my balloon by telling me that, hey, it's been done before. The Latin American novelists have done this as an experiment. But be that as it may, for me it was a first, and it was a delightful first. So yeah, there are ways and means, there are processes and processes. Having said that, even with that Intezar Hussain novel, it's not as though whatever I produced is what went into the book. Of course I edited it. Of course there were basic bloomers like tense. In Urdu, and to some extent in Hindi, writers love to use the present continuous tense. And it goes on and on and on for lines and lines and paras and paras. And then suddenly they will switch to the present perfect tense. In English, we like to use the present perfect. We don't like to use the present continuous. I am going, I am thinking. You'd rather say I thought or I think. You don't say I am thinking. It seems clumsy. So using the present continuous in English is clumsy and awkward and just plain bad grammatically. So maybe the first time when I was instinctively translating it, in that case, in the Intezar Hussain case, there was a lot of tense fixing I had to do, quite apart from the grammar and other things, because I was translating in real time as I was reading. Yeah. And then I put on my editor's cap and then began looking at hearing it, and it sounded awkward and clumsy and clunky. So that's when you fix it. But it's not just text. There could be many other things. There could be, again, you don't insert yourself in the editing. You are not in the business of correcting. If you think something is not clear, what I've learned to do is I insert a footnote and I say this, I think this is what he means. But I will resist the temptation to fix the original, because I don't think that's my job as a translator.
I love hearing about that specific example. And to dive into that a little bit more, I wanted to ask if there's been any kind of specific, can you think of a sentence, phrase, or like passage that really stumped you as a translation challenge?
So Intezar Hussain is writing in Urdu, and he's writing for an audience that, like him, understands the literary allusions, right? And he doesn't feel the need to explain them. They are blithe. They are just there, and they are there with a casual ease, which makes perfect sense for his Urdu readership. He's talking about living in he was from Bulandshahr before he migrated to Pakistan, and he's talking about a neem tree in his home in Bulandshahr, and suddenly there's a reference to a date palm, and then there's a reference to a cat, and there's been no cat all this while, and I'm like, where did this cat come from now? And then there's a sudden reference to Cordoba. Now, for his readers, that seamlessness makes sense because the subtext is he's talking about the past glories of Islam, and Cordoba fits in very naturally, very organically, and does not require an explanation for the Urdu reader. The cat might stump them a bit, but then they understand that he's now not in Bulandshahr, but he's in Cordoba, and the reference to the date palm is a kind of a clue. But I felt that when I'm reading this as an English reader, I'm a little confused. So I feel that I can't do anything about the original. It's there. I'm just translating it. But I can make things easier by inserting a footnote and then talking about, the place that cats have in a lot of Islamic societies. And so you go to Turkey, you see cats everywhere. So maybe I can be that helpful guide, as it were, So sometimes a translator is not just this is not an electronic transfer. It's not a bank transfer. It's not a transfer between two vocabulary banks. That's not what a translator is doing. A translator is, in a way, also a literary guide. So I thought that while I'll keep the larger reference to Islam and the glories of Islam in the 8th century to my introductory essay, where I will dwell upon it, but here, for this instance, on this page, in the physical space of that page, I think I could insert a footnote and maybe clarify this. Or there's an Urdu word for the niche of forgetfulness, and he uses that in the Urdu. But it sounds so poetic, and in the Urdu it requires no translation. But the niche of forgetful कि उसमें रख दिया और उसके बारे में भूल गए, I felt that let me give the literal translation here as a niche of forgetfulness, and then let me give its mystical allusion. It is used by Sufis, it is used in many ways. So words have allusions. Yes, the glossary serves a purpose, but the glossary does not, it has a space for meanings, but it doesn't always have a space for allusions. And I feel that the footnote helps me there. Of course, when this novel came out, a couple of reviewers were very brutal, and they said, this woman seems very fond of footnotes, and maybe there is no place for footnotes in translations. Be that as it may, I've been a relentless user of footnotes, and over the years I've continued to use footnotes because I feel that's a way of my entering a text without inserting myself in it.
And as much as it's important to give that context to the readers and explain, I think a lot of translators also believe that there are some things that should be left untranslated without really clarifying and explaining to the English reader. Where do you stand on that?
Yeah. I'm reminded of, I did English honors, and as an 18-year-old straight out of school in landlocked Delhi, I read Homer's Odyssey, and this constant references to the wine dark seas. I frankly didn't know what a wine dark sea was, but it seized my imagination to the extent that all these years later, I still remember it. And I think if he just said dark seas, that translator, whoever it was in those Penguin classics, wouldn't have served that purpose. So I don't think our job is to make everything accessible, as in instantly accessible. But yes, it can tease and arouse your imagination in some ways. It can, make you wonder what this might be. As an 18-year-old, I was so intrigued by the idea of a wine dark sea, and in a country where people were drinking wine, it seemed to come naturally to the narrator of the Odyssey to even refer to the darkness of the sea, to the purplish hue of wine, reddish purple, whatever. So I think a translator doesn't have to make everything bite-sized and instantly accessible, and we're not supposed to dumb down things that are there in all their complexity in the original. It might be complex, but why should we assume that the reader will not take that little bit of extra time and effort to dwell upon its possibilities, the possibilities that expression or that allusion is holding out? So let's not assume that we are dealing with people who are in a hurry or who don't especially want to engage with the text.
Absolutely. And before we open things up to the audience, I'd love to talk a little bit about your own fiction and the experience of self-translation. After decades of carrying other people's words across languages, you're now translating your own fiction into Hindi and preparing to publish your debut novel in October. I'm curious what that shift has been like. How has translation shaped you as a fiction writer?
So in 2010, I published a collection of short stories in English with HarperCollins. It was called Release and Other Stories. And then some years ago, because I'm reasonably bilingual, trilingual, Hindi, Urdu, English, I translated those stories into Hindi myself. The first of those was published in this Hindi literary journal called Hans. And then whenever I have a moment, I translate these stories into Hindi. Um, it's very interesting to revisit things that you wrote in 2010, and to look at one's own text. And here I allow myself the occasional liberty. I remember a conversation with Quratullah and Heather years and years ago, and her publisher and her editor Ritu Menon also used to talk about this, and has spoken about this publicly. That Quratullah and Heather's novel Aag Ka Darya was 4 times its size in Urdu, and it was 1/4 the size when it was translated by Quratullah and Heather in English. And Ritu Menon, who was her publisher, used to despair and say, you've left this out, What happened? Why we just jumped? Like decades and centuries, you've jumped from 7th century to 8th century, and you've left out all of that stuff that happened. And Quratullah and Heather would be blithe, and she would say, "Arey, koi baat nahi, mera hi to hai, kya farak padta hai?" So, there is a certain literary license, for want of a better word, that you have with your own text that you don't have with others. Quratullah and Heather took that liberty, and possibly rightly, that sprawling novel had the leisure of an Urdu reader to read it in all its, it had a spread, a very leisurely spread. And when she condensed it to 1/4 of its size in English, maybe she was right. So when I translate my English stories into Hindi, I'm not saying I'm condensing, they're pretty short in any case, but yes, I am taking more liberties with my own text than I would with somebody else's work, because I was a newbie fiction writer. That was my first jab at fiction in 2010. And sometimes I cringe. I said, did I write that? Oh my God, it's horrible. So I feel I can, fix that in my translation. And now, last year, in fact, I wrote my debut novel at 60 plus. I've been writing all kinds of other forms of writings, biographies and, literary histories and so on and so forth. But my first novel in English, it's an altogether different experience. You write fiction from what you have in your head or what you have in your heart, depending on how you want to say it. You don't need cross references and footnotes, and you don't need to sit in a library. In contrast, at the moment, I've rented a little cubicle in the India International Center Library. I'm writing the biography of a poet, Hasrat Mohani. It's a hugely annotated, cross-referenced thing, and so very different from the act of writing fiction. Every 2 sentences, I need to have a cross-reference. I need to look up something. I need to be very sure of my facts. I need to look up a date, a year, something or the other. I need to go looking into the library shelves for something about that period, if I'm talking about that period, in order to be absolutely sure that I'm locating Hasrat in the cross current of history. So I need to be very, very sure of my facts. So a biography is not just a person's life, it's also a person's life in chronological terms, especially an active politician, if he's taking part in the non-cooperation movement or the Khilafat movement. I need to have my historical facts right. In contrast, when I'm writing fiction, I don't need any aid. I don't need any cross-referencing, as it were. It's just what is in my imagination.
And to our audience, please look out for Rakhshanda's book coming out in October.
From Gangapur, it's called The Aunts of Gangapur.
Wonderful. And Rakhshanda, I believe many of us here can think of a writer, a book, a genre, or even like a literary tradition that deserves a much wider audience. So if resources, rights, and time were not an obstacle, what would your dream translation project be, and why?
I think memoirs need to be looked at more thoroughly. We have memoirs coming out every now and then. But as an industry, the publishing industry needs to look out for more memoirs from the bhashas, from the regional languages. There's such a wealth of lived experience, of oral testimonies hidden in these first-person accounts, in the memoirs, and the autobiographies. and not necessarily of big names or whatever, So let me give you an example. I was at a literary roundtable conference for translators organized by the Book Review, and we were talking about how often book review editors are lazy and they give, let's say, an Urdu book to an Urdu wala, or they give a Tamil book to a Tamil translator. And I said, book review editors need to stop being lazy about this. Let's read a translated text on its own as a standalone text. And the people who were organizing it took me up at face value, and then somebody wrote to me a couple of weeks after this workshop, and they said, look here, we are putting together a theme issue of the book review on Tamil literature, and you made that very grand announcement that people need to get out of their comfort zones of languages, so do you want to translate a Tamil book? And I was like stumped for a minute, and I said, why not? And they sent me a Tamil autobiography. Now I can't pronounce it, so I won't attempt to pronounce the name. I had to constantly cut and paste the name because it was difficult for me to pronounce and read, of the author. But the point is that I would never have read this wonderful memoir of a Tamil writer in English, because we are always in our comfort zones, you see. And because it was sent to me as a challenge for the review, I read it and enjoyed it enormously. And so I can say this to you today, that the one very neglected genre we have in our own readings, in publishers' concerns, in book reviewers' concerns, is this business of memoirs from the bhashas. Because they are, after all, what is literature's purpose? I think it's to open a window. It's to open a window, preferably into a life that is dissimilar to yours, which is not exactly like yours. That is the challenge, because why would you want to read a life that is very, very similar to yours? I think it would be mundane. So this is what I found when I read the memoir of this Tamil writer, that there were things, at one level, all writers' challenges, whether it's an Urdu writer in 1930 or a Tamil writer in 1930, at one level is the same. You're talking about very, very frugal advances. You're talking about publishers being, tardy with payments. So at one level, there's a commonality. But there are other things that are very new and very, interesting for you.
And finally, Rakshanda, many of us tuning in today are aspiring and even emerging translators. What would you tell someone hoping to begin or expand their body of translation work? What habits, skills, or ways of reading even matter most in becoming a good translator?
Well, I know this sounds very didactic, but I'm not being didactic. I'm saying this with all earnestness. Read, read, read. How much do you actually read? Everybody I know is in a hurry to be published. Everybody is in a hurry to start writing. But it's like wanting to run before you walk. So what are your building blocks? What is the soil that you prepared before you plant your seeds? Have you got a rich soil mix? Have you read enough? Have you read, let's say you want to translate. How many translated texts have you read? How many translated texts have you read from languages other than your own? Let's say you're a Hindi writer, or let's say you're a Urdu writer. Have you read Bangla? Have you read Marathi? Have you read Assamia? Have you read languages very, very different from your own in translation? And read them as standalone independent texts. That is the challenge sometimes. The context, good, but you can go looking for the context. Thanks to AI and thanks to the internet, finding the context is not the issue. But read a text in translation from a language very different from your own. Understand, and you will, believe me, I can't say this because this is not a workshop really, this is a conversation. So it's not easy for me to give you specific examples, but trust me, the more you read, you acquire an ear. I started, my first translation was at the grand age of 29, and that too because some kind stranger said to me, why don't you give it a try? But I really had no intention because I was so busy reading and having such a wonderful time reading all kinds of things. So the more eclectic you are as a reader, the more indiscriminate you are. And here I say this very consciously. Good, bad, indifferent. Read pulp fiction, read trash, read the classics, read whatever you can lay your hands on. So I'm not saying that, you need to have just the classics as your standard. No, if you don't read trash, how will you learn to make the distinction? Read popular fictions. Do you understand what people find accessible and interesting? So read all kinds of things. I mean, growing up, I read just about anything and everything I could lay my hands on. As a student of literature, of course, I had a curriculum that kept me on the straight and narrow. But even then, I managed to read Mills and Bones and just about everything.
Wholeheartedly agree with that. And we'll now open up the floor to questions from the audience. If you'd like to ask a question directly, please use the raise hand function, or feel free to drop your question in the chat and I'll read them out. I think we have a couple of questions from Saeed Ali. Saeed is asking, apart from translation, have you written anything, any of your own fiction, non-fiction, poetry, Urdu, English?
Okay, I haven't written in Urdu. I read Urdu, of course, and but I can write Urdu, but I haven't written anything in Urdu. And I've written in Hindi, as I just mentioned. I've done some translations into Hindi. And no, I don't write poetry in any language, so no. But yes, I've already answered that I have written fiction in English. And he has another question.
Yes, he's also asked any suggestions for short story writers, how to write more if a task is assigned to make a short story to a novel.
Well, I think your reading should come in handy. If you have read a great deal, that should come into handy. But I don't think there's a mathematical formula for turning a short story into a novel. ChatGPT might have a formula for you, but I, as somebody who writes and who's been writing, I'm afraid I can't offer you a E is equal to MC square sort of formula for it. There has to be enough in the short story to stretch, not just in terms of words, but content wise, thematically, characters. The characters need to be sufficiently have something in them in the original short story that you can flesh them out. Okay, let me give you an example. This novel that I mentioned that I've just written, by the way, it started out as a short story. And by the time I had written the first 5,000 words, I said, hey, this is a novel. This is not a short story, because I haven't even reached what I want to say. I'm nowhere close to it. I'm still building up. So this can't be a long short story. I might as well turn it into a novel. It's not a long novel. It's just 50,000 words. So by no means. And if I really wanted, I could have maybe compressed it into a long short story because there were enough characters. I subscribe to the old-fashioned school of thought about the short story, which says it should have a beginning, middle, and an end with a sting. This has been the classic definition of a short story from O. Henry and Maupassant and all the others. Of course, you have stream of consciousness short stories where you don't need to have a beginning, middle, and an end with a sting. But the classical definition has always been that. So if you have a story which has these three qualities, or even if it's an abstract stream of consciousness, a kind of a short story, if you think there is enough raw material in it for it to stretch to a novel, then yes, by all means. People have been known to do that.
Thank you, Said, for your question. Karishma, would you like to take the floor? I'll just add a spotlight for you.
Yeah, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yes. Hi, thanks, Shwetha and Rakhshanda, for this conversation. It was really interesting. I have two questions for you, Rakhshanda. So, you said that you don't think that because of what you were talking about Nasiruddin Shah, you said you wouldn't want to translate something. You know, because of what you were saying about Nasiruddin Shah and kind of working with something you really believe in, you said you wouldn't want to maybe translate a novel or a piece of work that whose ideas don't really work for you. And then you was also, but you have also worked on the collection on the male gaze, and then you just now spoke about the importance of reading all kinds of literature, trash and popular and mass and like literary stuff. So I'm curious to know if there is like, if you would also say translate trash or like mass fiction, because I recently read this Gujarati novel in translation, which I kind of struggled with after reading because I just thought that its ideas and its core ideology was somewhat problematic. And so I was wondering why the translator chose to translate that book.
Yeah.
I think that's my first question. And I think second question is that do you think after like with publishers like Tilted Access Press and other stories in the UK right now and the
I
recent
didn't
book
get the
aways.
second question.
Sorry, the second question is so like with publishers like Tilted Access Press and other stories in the UK right now, and how these publishers are taking a lot of interest in South Asian fiction and translated fiction. Do you think the publishing field in India has changed? Like, do you think there are more opportunities for translators to say publish directly with publishers in the UK? I mean, how does it work with agents and with for translators? Is there like more is it more accessible or is it not very accessible and kind of has not changed conditions in India at all for translators?
Okay, first question first. As a literary historian, I consciously do not make a distinction between high and low literature. I don't subscribe to the theory that this is high or classical literature and this is popular and therefore in some way inferior. I don't buy that at all. My last, one of my recent 2005 December was a collection called Best Known Stories of Urdu. And by no means did it have the biggies in them. You see, so I think as an editor, I'm being subjective and I'm choosing. So it had names that came as a surprise to many people that, okay, because they're either long dead and gone or they were popular in that time, Mahendra Kapoor and others, so you don't really remember them anymore. They may have been very popular in that time or they may have been moderately popular but well known in that time, but not so much now. So in that collection, I very consciously went looking for not the usual suspects, but what I think is a very representative sampling. So the book was called. I'm talking about two different books here. One was best fiction or best loved fiction, something like that in HarperCollins, and the other was from Simon and Schuster, and it was called Whose Urdu Is It Anyway? So in Whose Urdu Is It Anyway, I consciously went looking for not the big names, and I consciously went looking for non-Muslim Urdu writers, crude though it sounds. So also there was a politics to it that Urdu is not the language of Muslims. Urdu can be the language of whoever wishes to uh, appropriate it. But to answer your question, I have a wonderful example in mind. There was this very eminent writer, translator, Shamsul Rahman Farooqi, who wrote in Urdu. Now there was a very popular but considered trashy or popular in a pejorative sense detective fiction series, the Ibn Safi series, and people would read it on the sly because it wasn't highbrow literature. Now this very highbrow person translated it into English from Urdu and published it. And suddenly the curtain was lifted from, as it were, everybody's dark secret that, oh, even I like Ibn Safi actually. So I think that was a very good thing to have done because, it brings the popular into the mainstream. And if you have something like that in mind and it appeals to you, it seizes your imagination for whatever reason, and you wish to share that with others, by all means, go ahead. Coming to your second question, look, I have been published abroad, but it's always been rooted through my publisher. So I don't know how to approach an agent abroad. I'm told that having an agent is imperative in UK and US. You cannot work without, let's say, you wish to publish in the UK, you need to route through an agent because were you to write at the usual, directly to publishers, it will just languish in some inbox. In India, again, I think it's the day and age of the lit agents has dawned. They are facilitators, which is not to say that we don't know of people, first-time publishers, who somehow or the other wrangled a publishing deal entirely on their own without. But by and large, in the last 4 or 5 years, I'm seeing literary agents playing a huge role, especially for first-time writers, especially not just first-time, even others. I think they help you get better advances. They help you negotiate better terms. And with this day of OTT and other things, they help you negotiate terms and conditions. They help you navigate the contract. So yeah, whether it's India or abroad, I think it's not a bad idea to go through a lit agent, because more often than not, even though they say that they go through what comes in their inboxes, I somehow think it kind of languishes, and I'm not sure how many people statistically get published who've randomly written to a publisher. Somebody needs to do a research on that.
And Karishma, thank you for your question. You mentioned the Gujarati translation you read. May I recommend the Bleft anthology of Gujarati pulp fiction, which I think you might enjoy.
Yeah, it was Blaft, by the way, that had published Shamsur Rahman Farooqi's crime anthologies as well. So Blaft is really the person to reach out.
Any other questions from the audience?
We don't seem to have an audience, do we?
We have a few. Oh, Roman, I think you're muted.
Rakshanda, if it's okay, could I jump in with a question as well, out of
Yes,
curiosity?
please do, Roman.
You were already touching up. I mean, whose Urdu is it anyway, right? That notion that Urdu belongs to Muslims and the correlate Hindi belongs to the Hindus. I mean, I think that, even if we rewind pre-1947, I think the politics of the language, of both languages, and then post 47 into present day, I think there's been so much politics layered onto these languages. I'm curious, because you've read so widely in both, how you've seen the politics perhaps changing the languages. I think that now also there's the sense that Urdu is this thing of high refinement, right? I mean, it is almost like the in India, at least, perhaps not in Pakistan, to quote Urdu, to be able to speak Urdu rather than Hindi is seen as almost a class thing. So all of these changes and kind of the social politics of the languages changing, I'm just curious how you've seen through your reading the languages changing, and especially how you see the two of them today.
You're asking a bunch of things, and I dearly love to address each one of them, but let's see how much I remember. Well, it goes back to 1901 with an order from Lord Curzon at that point and it even predates the division of Bengal. So there was the 1901 order, which was saying that you can start writing government orders in Hindi, was seen as a boost for Hindi and was seen as a slight by the Urduwalas. So from 1901, we see something that is just snowballing. And then as we approach the freedom struggle and the years leading up to the freedom movement, it kind of entangles itself in the national project. And something which was a linguistic debate somehow becomes, or is in some instances, what shall I say, kind of harnessed into the national project. So there is a Hindu nationalism which hijacks Hindi nationalism and links Hindi with nationalism, and inadvertently, or maybe knowingly, makes Urdu the language of the other. And so it's by no means a recent or a post partition phenomena. We see it very, very clearly from 1901 onwards, and it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's like a snowballing thing. It then acquires a life of its own. So that was one question. What were the other things you were asking?
Just in terms of how you think the politics are of both, or how the politics that's layered onto both languages is changing them
Politics
today.
is so you have Hindi walas and Urdu walas like wrestlers in a pit, occupying two ends of a wrestling pit. And as I said in the beginning of the debate, the simpler thing would be to look at commonalities, because there is a great deal in common, right? But instead, people have chosen to harp on the differences. You talked of a bunch of things. You talked of the so-called sophistication that is assumed with Urdu, and a person speaking Urdu is seen or assumed to be sophisticated. Well, Urdu is a cosmopolitan language. Urdu is a city language. Urdu doesn't really have its roots in the rural hinterland of India. There it becomes khadi boli, or it becomes the bhasha, the dialect. But Urdu, as we understand it, is a city-based language. So yes, there is a certain, well, sophistication, refinement, call it what you will. But there is such even well-meaning people. Khushwant Singh, he said, इश्क करना है तो उर्दू सीखो. If you wish to love, or if you wish to fall in love, learn Urdu. A beautiful statement, a benign statement, but in the longer run, it does damage to Urdu because it perpetuates the stereotype that Urdu is the language of ishq and mohabbat. You see, I have nothing against ishq and mohabbat. By all means, I mean, it's a fact that a great deal of very romantic poetry has been written in Urdu. But what we then do is, it's like a woman saying, oh, she's so beautiful. So therefore, she's incapable of being anything else. She's incapable of being a good banker or a scientist or what have you, because you're only looking at how she appears, her looks. So with Urdu, that it's a very beautiful language. But what about the vim and vigor, the political muscle of Urdu? Why do we forget that? Inqilab Zindabad was the nara that was given, the slogan that was given by Hasrat Mohani, whose biography I'm currently writing. And so he comes to mind very naturally for me. But we have so many examples of Urdu poets who've written extraordinary political poetry, and outright political poetry, not couched in symbols and metaphors and allusions, but outright political poetry. Faiz, whom we talked about before we started this conversation. So there are so many examples in Urdu of people not just talking about the beauty of a woman or the beauty of a sunrise or a sunset, but talking about women who work in farms as labor, as about industrial workers. There is all of that, but that is overlooked. Why? Because in a purely benign sense, here I'm not attributing any darker motive, but in a purely benign sense, we say, oh, it's such a beautiful language. Well, yes, I mean, a Tamil speaker will find their language beautiful, a Khasi speaker will find their language beautiful. So what is this obsession with beauty? That, I think, is problematic, why don't we instead see what is there behind and in that literary culture and in that reservoir of literary talent? I would much rather people go looking for that rather than seeing it through the lens of beauty.
That's all fascinating, and of course, Fez is the prime example. Hum dekhenge, etc. Hopefully, that poem and how viral it has become maybe will change some minds. But thank you for that.
Yeah.
And finally, we have a question from Gaia, who's actually one of our translators in this edition of Fiction Fest. She's saying, thank you for a great conversation and some wonderful insights. I like what you said about allusions, got me thinking about the issue we have in translation. I would like to know, do you translate for the author or do you translate for the reader?
Oh no, I translate for the reader. In barely a handful of instances have I had the author with me or in my mind. Gulzar Saab, whom I've translated, and my newest book is Amchi Mumbai, which is Gulzar Saab's poems and short stories about Mumbai. That is the only instance that comes to mind where the author has been with me in the journey of translation. In the past, when I was translating, let's say, Shahryar or Intezar Hussain, who were pretty much alive, but were disinvested in the act of translation. They said, "Aap jo kar rahi hain, theek hai." Or I was translating people who were dead and gone, Manto, Krishan Chandar, Bedi, and Faiz, and so on and so forth. So I have the two comparisons to make, as it were. When I work with a living poet like Gulzar Saab, we have these long Zoom conversations and we go over every word, every line, every comma, every full stop. And I learn a great deal from him because, as I said, I'm not a poet. It's not in my DNA. I see poetry on a page. I hear it with my ear, but I have no other intangible means of accessing poetry that maybe a poet does. So when I work with him and he says, just knock out this word, I'm saying, but you have it there in the original. He says, knock it out, let's see. And I knock it out, and truly, I mean, not only is it compact, it's tighter, it's crisper, it's lighter. And then I say, yeah, actually, why didn't I think of that? So there's a lot to be learned by translating, especially poetry, with a poet like Gulzar Saab. But that's the only instance I can share where I'm working with the author. But otherwise, when I translate, oh, I'm only thinking of the reader. I'm being faithful. Like I say, I put a great deal of importance, give a great deal of importance to fidelity to text. And that one is very, very old fashioned, because modern day translators think fidelity is an overrated virtue. But I think fidelity to text is and should be the cornerstone of any active translation. And insofar, you have the author in mind. But who are you translating for? Certainly not the author. It's clearly the reader. No doubt about that.
Rakshanda, thank you so much for such a rich conversation.
Thank you. Pleasure. See you. Bye-bye.
And thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. Just a reminder that Fiction Fest is still underway, with the final story coming out on Friday. If you haven't already, please do visit the Himal website and spend some time with this wonderful collection of translations. And if you've enjoyed tonight's conversation and would like to support our work, we'd be grateful if you consider becoming a Himal patron. We currently have a special anniversary discount available on our website, so please head on over there to support our work. And thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful day or evening wherever you are.